Hi there and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. Now, last time I was looking at Moshe Lewin's history of the Soviet peasantry under Stalin, and I really wanted to return to this because I think that, I talk a lot about the Soviet Union, I talk a lot about Stalinism on this podcast, and it's easy to do things in very broad brushstrokes and talk about the process of collectivization and the famines and the Soviet terror in very general terms. But of course, when we're talking about huge numbers of people, the Soviet peasantry obviously making up the majority of the population, it becomes very easy for us to think that this was a homogenized block of people. And any logical person would instinctively think, surely not, and of course it's not. This is not the case. The Soviet peasants are not one, homogeneous block of people. They are ethnically, socially, and culturally diverse over this vast country, or vast series of countries. But also they existed within certain class stratifications. These predated the Soviet regime, some of them. Some of them were the product of Tsarism. Some of them were kind of organically created. The place that certain peasants had in society was the kind of the product of development of society. And some of these class stratifications were imposed by the Soviet regime. The Soviet regime found it easy to classify certain kinds of peasants and difficult to classify others, because some peasants didn't fit into the schemas that were created by Marxist-Leninism, the kind of the version of how society in theory should function. So we're going to look at the first category, the Serednyaks, and these were really the poorer peasants. So Moshe Lewin writes, the Serednyaks made up the greater part of the peasantry, defined in terms of party propaganda as the central figures in agriculture. They were poor tenants of small farms, very weak agricultural producers, and in many cases illiterate or almost so. It was in this light that they saw themselves, rather than as impressive figures. Nevertheless, they were in fact at the very heart of social and economic life of the country, and as such they provided a perpetual source of trouble for the regime and its theoreticians. The party had great difficulty in defining the exact social function of the Serednyak in the accepted Marxist-Leninist terms. Lenin, for example, never made it clear whether he looked upon the peasantry as a stratum or a class. I suppose the difference there is a stratum is a kind of an element of a particular social class, whereas a social class, like the peasants or the workers, are distinct and recognisably different from any other social group with different values, ideas, outlooks and class interests. On occasion he even used both terms in the same sentence, when referring exclusively to the Serednyak. When we consider a stratum such as the middle peasants, it would appear that this is the kind of class which vacillates, referring to the peasant in general. He goes on, he is partly a property owner, partly a worker. He does not exploit other workers. For years he had to defend his position against the greatest odds. He suffered exploitation at the hands of the pomeshchiki and the capitalists. He put up with everything. Nevertheless, he is a property owner. For this reason, the problem of our attitude towards this vacillating class is one of enormous difficulty. So where do we stand with the Serednyak? Do we view them as the exploited or the exploiter? And it seems like Lenin is coming down on the idea that any property owner must, by extension, be an exploiter, or must be potentially a member of an enemy social class, and therefore must be destroyed, perhaps with some reluctancy, but ultimately destroyed. Leaving aside a certain vagueness in terminology, which reflects the complex nature of the question, Lenin clearly and repeatedly stated that he was well aware of the difficult task which confronted the Soviet regime, both from the political and the doctrinal point of view, in dealing with the deceptively simple muzhik, which is a peasant. Theoreticians of the 30s, who were given to oversimplification and had neither the talent nor the intellectual stature of their master, writes Lewin, nor indeed the opportunity to express themselves freely, were frequently driven almost to despair in their efforts to classify this amorphous mass of the peasantry. They even went so far as to identify 4 distinct classes: the proletariat, the semi-proletariat, the Serednyak, and the rural bourgeoisie. But by the same dubious process of reasoning, these 4 classes could equally have been said to exist within the Serednyak stratum itself, for it is not true to say that the Serednyak did not exploit. Indeed, Lenin himself, in the other article, stated that the Serednyak hired labour fairly often, and that while he was a worker, he was at the same time a shark and a speculator. So, I think this tells us, in essence, more about the early Soviet regime than it tells us necessarily about the complexities of rural life. The desire to classify, to stratify, to apply broad characteristics to complex human beings and to complex human behaviour. This was something that the centralised state, which had a huge mistrust of its people and an anxious and precarious grip on power for much of the time, this was something that was viewed as a prime purpose of the state to accurately describe the sorts of people that they were dealing with. Of course, in the vastness of Russia, it was entirely possible for large parts of the country to be, not just to bureaucrats, but to most people, to be largely unknowable. This idea that the Serednyak hired labour often, was a worker as well, and in Lenin's view was therefore a shark and a speculator. Well, that's to apply, it's to apply Marxist-Leninist discourse to something that really defies that description. If you imagine what life was like in late 19th and early 20th century peasant villages, the web of social relations, of friendships, of obligations, of debts, and of kind of allegiances, of the politics of the villages would have been incredibly complex, and the idea that somebody was an employer would probably be of a fairly alien concept. It might be that your neighbour hires 2 of your strongest sons to help him for the afternoon because his boys are away at market, or it might be that something needs to be done in the village, such as a ditch dug, or somebody's repairs need to be made to somebody's small holding. Those kinds of things. But nobody would have viewed anybody in the village as being how we would imagine a capitalist or a member of the capitalist classes to be. And much of the problem here, as David Graeber writes about, is the problem of what economists and economic thinking does. It takes interactions, it applies the concept of homo economicus to far more complex human beings. It presupposes that our interactions with one another are simply calculations that one can draw out on a spreadsheet or on a page. And it doesn't see any of these relations within a kind of the wider social context that human beings are constantly creating for themselves. And Lenin was a kind of a particularly brutal example of this. Moshe Lewin has an interesting way of resolving this issue. He writes, if the peasant, middle or otherwise, vacillated, it was because he was all too often confronted by alternatives which baffled him, especially if he were illiterate. Faced with similar alternatives, intellectuals and proletarians were at times even more hesitant. It was not the peasant who had the split personality, as suggested by terminology which was itself excessively divorced from reality, but rather the party which repeatedly wavered and shifted in its policy towards the Serednyak, adopting first one line and then another, while each change in policy was usually accompanied by deviations and excesses, the brunt of which was borne by the peasant in general and the middle peasant in particular. So the state that cannot make its mind up about the kinds of people it's dealing with, and the Soviet state in particular was based on the need to be waging class warfare against its enemies, and so it was imperative that it understood who the peasants were. This is why this is so crucial, and more crucial for the Soviet state than any other. The party, writes Moshe Kluin, and especially the local activist executive, always found it much easier to deal in extremes, to put its faith in one group and distrust another. But when obliged simultaneously to trust and distrust the same social group as doctrine prescribed in almost so many words, it lost its assurance. The activist, constantly urged by his superiors to follow lines of conduct which seemed to him to be contradictory, dispensed favours or retribution according to his own lights, only to find himself accused of excesses and deviations from a line which was itself, by definition, assumed to be entirely correct. So here we get to kind of the crux of the issue, in that the state after 1917 is busy engaged in a form of endless class warfare. The Soviet regime is predicated on the idea that very quickly after the revolution there will be counter-revolutionary pressures or counter-revolutionary forces which will try to destroy the Soviet regime, and that these will come from within. There might be invasions from overseas, as the British, the French, the Americans, and the Japanese showed from 1918 onwards. But for the most part, you don't worry about them too much. It's the counter-revolutionaries within. Some of those represented by the white armies and nationalist movements, but the big worry is counter-revolutionary peasants. And in 1921, during the Antonov Revolt, Lenin himself says that the Antonov Revolt is an uprising of peasants against the policy of war communism and against the Bolshevik state. Lenin himself says that this is much more dangerous than at any other time during the Civil War, because the peasants are the majority of the population and they control the ability to produce food. So during the early phases of the regime and up until and after collectivisation, the question of who the peasants are and what threat they pose is one that is uppermost in the minds of the regime. So hence when this answer about the Serednyaks can't be resolved, you have party activists and party bosses who have to make case-by-case judgments. You look more like a capitalist, you look more like a worker, and then inevitably there would be times when said party activists would be shown to be wrong, but it's almost, as it says here, almost impossible to be right. There are plenty of examples of such shifts in party policy. The result of the departure by the plenum of October 1924 from the administrative and pro-Bedniak line, and of subsequent measures further implementing NEP, have been described by Katayevich, who had access to the Central Committee source material. The activist could make nothing of the sudden volte-face and felt like he had been betrayed. Despite the new decisions of 1925, the Bedniaks were completely neglected. If you listen to, I talked about the Bedniaks in my previous podcast. The Serednyaks and the kulaks were gaining control of the selsoveti. The selsoveti were the rural councils that replaced the mir. The Bedniaks were the poor peasants. They had been a kind of, I don't want to say a favourite of the Bolsheviks, but the Bolsheviks certainly saw a lot of value in them. And during the collectivisation period, the poor peasants' committees were those which were given the full backing of state power against the kulaks, and poor peasants in the villages were really encouraged to act out all their resentments against the kulaks, and to appropriate and confiscate kulak property and administer punishments. And the Bedniaks, who had, and the poor peasant committees that had initially after 1917 initially a significant increase in their power and status in the villages. By the 1920s, during NEP, as it says here, the kulaks and the Serednyaks, the top and the middle tier of the peasantry, start to claim back a significant amount of power, and during the various plenums of the party, there was a lot of disquiet that the peasantry, a kind of a rural bourgeoisie is being re-established. Part of this, of course, is to do with the fact that after Lenin's death in 1924, there's no clear direction about what's meant to occur with the new economic policy, how long it's meant to last for, and what's meant to come afterwards. Lenin hadn't really been able to articulate that in his dying years. And so Stalin, in a way, in 1928, resolves these questions and says basically, this is what is coming, this is what is happening. So Moshe Lewin writes, sensing that it was losing control in the countryside, the party applied the brake and issued new instructions in order to remedy the situation during the electoral campaign of 1926 to 27. The results, as described in a collection of essays and articles, were as follows. The Bedniaks were being forced into the Selsovti by all possible means, and the Serednyaks were being thrust aside. So now the poor peasants from 1926 onwards are being advanced once again. The right to vote was being withdrawn indiscriminately, and thousands of complaints from unjustly treated Serednyaks were pouring into the electoral committees. These injustices, it was claimed, would be rectified later as far as possible, but certain persons, particularly the middle peasants, the same source stated, are beginning to feel that the party and the Soviet regime are deliberately excluding them from direct participation in the government and control of the state. In order to calm the fears of these persons, a series of measures were adopted by the plenum of February 1927, which at the same time deviationists were accused of having aided the kulaks, and of having, by their neglect of the Serednyaks and their exclusive support of the Bedniak candidates, jeopardised the dictatorship of the proletariat. So essentially, delegates at the plenum of the 27th of February were being told two separate things. They're being told at the same time that you're helping the kulaks, you're helping the rich peasants, and that also having neglected the Serednyaks and having helped the poor peasants, the Biedniaks, too much, so having helped the top and the bottom and ignored the middle, that you're jeopardising this term, the dictatorship of the proletariat. And what that meant really, when they were starting to introduce the language, the term of the proletariat into the conversation, it meant that the dictatorship of the proletariat, the rule of the workers in the Soviet Union, was being put in jeopardy, because ultimately control of the countryside and the ability to control the peasants to continue producing food was the only way in which the towns and cities were going to be fed. And the towns and cities have precarious food supplies throughout the entirety of the 1920s and for much of the 1930s. And this meant that the workers' regime was in dire peril. The moment the cities starve, essentially Soviet communism is over. One commentator wrote, "There was a flagrant lack of comprehension of the party's directive concerning the reinforcement of the organisation of the Biedniaks. It has been forgotten that this reinforcement presupposed the simultaneous growth and strengthening of links between the bloc of the Biedniaks and the Serednyaks, the basic mass of the peasantry in the countryside." So, to make sense of what the party is trying to do, it was assumed that ultimately, if you perhaps bully the Serednyaks a bit, they'll stop being so capitalist. They'll stop doing this thing called hiring a neighbour to help shoe a horse, or hiring a neighbour to help dig a well. Hardly capitalism. What they'll do is they will sort of descend to the level of the Biedniaks. They will become like the poorer peasants, and so you create eventually a homogeneous block of poor peasants. You get rid of this complexity that's causing all these problems, and then you turn those poor peasants on the kulaks. So this is the grand strategy of the Communist Party in the Russian countryside and Ukrainian, Belarusian and beyond. And as we've seen before on the podcast, and as we will no doubt see again, the beginnings of the war on the kulaks start within the villages. The poor peasants' committees are encouraged to attack their slightly more well-to-do neighbours and to see them as enemies within. So we'll continue this. I really like Moshe Lirin and the depths to which the detail and the level of research and the writing and the skill and the talent of him, and so we're going to continue with him probably in the next couple of months. Anyway, thanks very much, and I'll catch you on the next Explaining History podcast. All the best. Bye-bye.